You're trying to give the young people something that will help them, yet you don't know exactly what it ought to be.
Welcome to the TeachThought podcast. Terry, introduce yourself.
My name is Terry Ike. I'm a former classroom teacher and now director at TeachThought, which means I do a lot of different things very badly.
And I'm Drew Perkins. I'm the Director of Professional Development here at TeachThought, and hopefully that means I do a lot of different things really well.
And together we're hosting a podcast, which hopefully makes TeachThought more accessible to you in more places, right, Drew?
Well, hopefully, yeah, but mostly it's just me hosting it because you just add episodes every so often, right?
Well, I've got things to do. Remember, I'm director.
That's true. As always, thanks for tuning in to the podcast. My name is Drew Perkins. I am the Director of TeachThought Professional Development. And as always, I encourage you to check out our website, wegrowteachers.com, for all of our options for professional learning, which is workshops and podcasts and blogs, and of course our summer TeachThought PBL Grow event, which you can find at wegrowteachers.com/grow18. You can also email me at drew@teachthought.com with comments, questions, concerns, or our phone number is 502-373-0040. In today's podcast, I spoke with Peter DeWitt, and I really enjoyed this conversation, not only because of the content, but he's also quite easy to talk with. I think he even talked about himself as being the great communicator, jokingly. But his work around collaborative leadership certainly aligns with a lot of our work around professional learning and leadership and transparency and communication. So we talked about his work as it relates to turning some of the research of John Hattie to more practical and pragmatic, and how much of that work needs to be founded in that data and research, and the idea of learning together and flattening and empowering your staff, as well as innovating schools and how you might move that work forward in ways that is not getting into what we might call that initiative fatigue. So we certainly talked about that and lots of other things. I hope you enjoy the podcast as much as I do. And without further ado, here's Peter DeWitt. I have Peter DeWitt with me today, who is calling in via Skype from his home in Albany, New York. And Peter, if you're not familiar with Peter, you should be on Twitter, jumping on his Twitter feed and some of the conversations he's having around school leadership and some coaching pieces. But he's an author and a consultant, and I'm going to give him an opportunity to introduce himself because I'm sure he can do a much better job of it. So Peter, welcome to the podcast, and tell our listeners a little bit more about yourself.
Thanks, Drew. I appreciate you having me on. I am a former school teacher. I taught elementary school for 11 years in a couple of high poverty city schools. And then I went directly into a principalship in a suburban rural school district where I was for about 7.5 to 8 years. I left about 4.5 years ago because I started working with John Hattie as a visible learning trainer, and then just kind of presenting with John and doing his work in North America and Australia, and started doing instructional coaching trainings for Jim Knight as well. And then it's turned into my own work around collaborative leadership and school climate over the past couple of years. So I'm on the road about 46, 47 weeks a year. And I do a lot of work in North America, and then occasionally I'm in the UK and Australia as well. So it's nice to be here.
Yeah, and you have a blog on Education Week, and I'll, as always, we link to things, but as we go through, if there's any resources in other places, let's just go ahead and you're an author, so let's get those things, the books and things out there so that folks can look at them right now.
I've been writing for Education Week since 2011, one of the best things that happened to me in my life, and I write a blog called Finding Common Ground for Ed Week. I've written several books. One was on my doctoral work, which was called Safeguarding LGBT Students, Dignity for All Safeguarding LGBT Students, I should say. I have a mini book called Flipping Leadership Doesn't Mean Reinventing the Wheel that I did with Corwin Press as a part of the Connected Educator series that I actually created with my editor, Arnis Burvikovs, and Ariel Price. And then I have an ARIAS through AACD on school climate, and then I have a few other books, Collaborative Leadership, 6 Influences That Matter Most, which is through Corwin Press, and School Climate, Leading with Collective Efficacy, which is through Corwin Press. And I have a new book coming out in September called Coach It Further, using the art of coaching to impact school leadership. And that is actually going to be a narrative book. It's a story that takes place through characters. So I'm really excited about that because honestly, out of all my books, that has gotten the best feedback out of any book that I've ever written. So, and it wasn't easy to write, but it was also really gratifying when I finished up. So that's me.
Interesting. So when you say narrative, you're talking, so is this fictional or is it non-fictional, or it's a story, right? So
Yeah, it's a little bit of both. I mean, I'm sure there's some true parts of the story woven in because of my leadership and the fact that I coach leaders and everything else, but it's basically a fiction, and it's actually in the spirit of like Patrick Lencioni's 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. I was really profoundly impacted by that book, and I really liked his writing style. And when Corwin came to me about my next book, I wanted to do something different. And it ended up, I wrote in the School Climate book, I have sort of a narrative between 2 characters, but it was only for maybe a couple of pages per chapter. And honestly, during the feedback process, somebody said, I really like the narrative style, and I would love it if you wrote a book like that. So I did. I took the challenge, and I'm very, very happy with it and looking forward to it coming out.
Interesting. That's a lot of writing and lots of books, and I don't know if you do it while you're on the road or what, but I've been threatening to complete, I think I may have mentioned it once or twice in the podcast at some point. I'm trying to work on a book based on my oldest daughter, Sadie P. and Her Curious Case of Questions, and do a children's book, and I just keep threatening, and it's on my list of to-do, so I'm jealous and envious, and how you must have a better work ethic than I. So let's kind of get into your work, and I like the art of coaching line, as best I can tell. At least according to my radar, and perhaps I'm way wrong on this because I just wasn't aware of your work several years ago, but all of a sudden it seems like you've really gained a lot of popularity, and again, correct me if I'm wrong in that, and I'm just myopic about it, but is there anything in particular that you see or feel, if in fact that's the case, that why is your work really resonating with people, and is your increased, popularity or visibility or that it's resonating with people, is it related to anything outside of just what you're talking about? Is it sort of the conditions that education finds itself in more recently?
Yeah, no, you're not wrong at all, actually. Many people think I'm an overnight success, but it just happened to be that it took me years to get here. I have presented to lots of empty rooms. I started presenting a long time ago for the International Center for Leadership and Education, Bill Daggett and Ray McNulty, back in like 2007, 2008. But I did it a few times and then walked away so I could do my doctoral work. And during the doctoral work, I started writing reflective pieces as part of the doctoral work, and those ended up turning into articles for our New York State School Administrators Association's journal. So my education writing really started back in around 2010, 2011. Dignity for All, the LGBT work, was not popular at the time. I actually got some a fair amount of hate mail when that was coming out and when I was blogging about that topic. And then with Flipping Leadership, it was a book that, it was a short form book, and I think people liked the idea, but it really didn't go too far. It was really after I started working with Hattie and started working with Jim Knight that I was on the road presenting. And I think that's what is probably different for me than maybe other people who are in the principalship who are writing books, because what I have learned over time is that you really have to be on the road promoting your book, and principals can't always do that. So when I was on the road doing workshops, I tended to get really good feedback, but I'll be honest with you, I was working really hard. Meaning that I was paying attention to feedback. Some of the feedback hurt, but I needed to take it into consideration, and I needed to transition from delivering content to an audience to understanding the audience context, and then figuring out where the content worked for them. And I think during that time, I was also working with John, and John has been incredibly good to me. He's been very supportive. When he's been on the road, he's talked about the work that I do. And that's pretty amazing to have John Hattie doing that. And then, so I was doing John's work, and then I was doing coaching for Jim Knight, who's also had a profound impact on me. And I sort of saw this missing niche, which was the leadership piece. And I started really paying attention to what leaders were being prepared to do at the university level, but actually being asked to do when they were out in the field. And because I have 8 years of experience with that under my belt, and we went through some pretty horrific times in my school district, I think all of that started to come together in this sort of perfect storm over the past couple of years in a very positive way. Collaborative leadership actually was a topic I started talking about 9 months before the book came out. And what I started to notice is that when I went into rooms to present, they were completely full and standing room only. And I thought, I'm onto something here, because it was based on John's research. And John has said this too many times, but he said that I make his research incredibly practical. He calls me the great communicator. And, you know, I love that, because John's the research and I can do the practical side. And I think people were very keen to hearing how his research could be applied in a practical sense. And then, you know, with my instructional coaching knowledge, because of working with Jim, and his work really spoke to me because I felt like that's what kind of leader I was. I started getting a lot of instructional coaches in the audience. So when that book came out, it actually went to bestseller for Corwin 3 weeks after it was published, which is not an experience I had ever had before. I had never had a bestseller. And then that work just started to take off, where I created workshops. And then all of a sudden I got asked to do, you know, could you take this workshop and make it state level work? There's a guy, Jim Verlengia in Iowa, who has been very supportive and said, you know, we'd really love this for certification work at the state level. And so I created something for them, and that took off. And then the University of Oklahoma, Lisa Pryor and Robin Anderson. Lisa's from the University of Oklahoma and Robin's from the state education department. They contacted me, and I had done a webinar for them, and they said, we would really love you to teach a cohort leadership program for people who are already assistant principals or principals. And I think all of those opportunities coming together were fantastic learning opportunities for me. Like, the pressure was on me to make sure that I delivered something that was going to be things they could use the next day they walked into their building. But at the same time, it was an incredible learning experience. And I can give you an example of that. Sometimes I was working with assistant principals, and they said their biggest barrier was their principal. And that was very sad for me. And the assistant principal thing was never in my wheelhouse, because I wasn't one, and I never had an assistant principal. So like all of those pieces that came out during workshops were very much a learning experience. And I think all of that together sort of maybe gave me a reputation that people understood that I would sort of take the content that I had and I would make it pertinent to what they needed, as opposed to just sort of dropping this program on them. And, you know, I to be perfectly honest with you, and one of the other things is that I'm always honored when people show up to a room, because quite honestly, I've had those moments when nobody showed up to the room. So when you've got people coming in and asking you to sign their books and stuff, I think that's a moment where you should be very humble and honored. And so I think all of that is maybe what has resonated over the past couple of years, and it's probably why you're hearing my name more now than you had in the past.
Yeah, there's lots to unpack there, and as I'm sort of writing notes and jotting ideas and things down, and the idea that collaborative leadership, the coaching pieces come together, or I guess resonate with so many people, I think is one of the things we try to facilitate in that way as well, in so far as that you're not just it is so important that you're not just dropping a sort of canned approach, and with our facilitators, because it's really coaching. I think that that professional learning events or professional development or workshops or all those things certainly need to engage. It's so important to engage people in thinking and processing and reflecting, and you have to be fluent enough in that work or that sort of subject to be able to ask the right questions, but you also have to have that skill, and it sounds like that's a vital piece of what you do. The great communicator. I don't know. Are you going to be running for president?
No.
Using Ronald Reagan as your.
Yeah, I know. John's a big history buff, an American history buff, so that scares me a little bit. But no, those days are not happening.
Yeah, well, there is a big gap, I think, between research and the pragmatic approach. And I guess one of the questions that comes to my mind as you talk about Hattie, because people have used Hattie's research. We have blog pieces that refer to Hattie's research, and there's sometimes a pushback on methodology and data collection, all those things for sure. But for your work, or in your mind, as we're talking about transforming schools and leadership, how much of that needs to be founded and grounded in data and research, or is there some flexibility and leeway there as you think about it?
That's a great question. Yeah, I think that the thing I've tried to understand about John's research is, John brought me down to New Zealand a few years ago, and that was the first time I had met him in person. And he told me the story about how one of the ministries of education in the world was misusing his research and what he said. And I think I think that had an impact on me, because I walked away thinking, I'm writing about this guy's work in my blog, and I want to make sure I do it correctly. So John would read the blog before I put it up there, because I wanted to know that I was not contributing to the bad side, the misunderstanding, that I was actually contributing to a clearer understanding. And, I'm sort of lucky because John will ask me for feedback on his papers. So there was that dual kind of relationship that we had, that reciprocal, that we would learn from each other. Yeah, and the methodology is nothing that I stay away from. I actually address that every time that I present and start talking about John's research. John has actually clarified that within my blog. He's written guest blogs, but also in other avenues he's taken too, which I think is fantastic. And I get where people are coming from with the methodology piece. I think that what my biggest message is when I'm talking about John's work, or when I'm talking about collaborative leadership or leadership in general, is this idea of understanding your impact. And I think that because John's research involves 300 million students and all of these thousands upon thousands of research articles, my biggest thing is when I see leaders go into a classroom to do a walkthrough and they leave a feedback sheet for a teacher that, they may have been in there for like 10 minutes and they didn't see what they were looking for, and they walked out and kind of dinged the teacher on that. And, my message is always kind of like, how sure are you that what you're looking for is actually working? And how sure are you as a leader that what you're doing is actually impacting the school climate in a positive way? Because if you're leaving a feedback sheet for a teacher and you've never talked about the goal around where that feedback is going to be directed, then you're really doing feedback to a teacher, not with a teacher. And, in that same spirit, I've had leaders tell me that they tell teachers to stay away from certain influences on learning because it doesn't have a high effect size. And John does not say that. And, he always says these are average effect sizes, meaning that they worked better in certain places and they didn't work well in other. And it's about understanding your current reality and figuring out where to go from there. And, it's hard because as a building leader, you're handed the keys after you go through your degree. You're handed the keys to the building, and then there's virtually not a lot out there for you. All the professional development is sort of geared at teachers. And I think that I just want to be conscious to say, I want leaders to come to me after a couple of years under their belt so we can figure this out together. I don't want them to feel like they do it alone. And that's where I bring in sort of the self-efficacy and collective efficacy work as well. So that balance for me between research and practical I think it's, I always look at it through the Goldilocks principle lens. What's too hard? What's too soft? What's just right? I think there are times that we can be too researchy, if that's a word.
Sure.
And then there are other times that we're very, very practical, but we're not really sure if it's working or not. So I think finding that balance between both, that sweet spot, is what's important. And that's what I try to do when I'm running workshops or coach. But quite honestly, I have to be honest with you, Drew, when I'm running workshops, even when I'm doing the state work or the university work, I always try to cap it and say, listen, I'm going to work with you 5 times. And we're going to collect evidence together, and you're going to bring it back every month, and we're going to talk through it, because by that 5th time, it is my job to build capacity, and you shouldn't need me anymore. Like those are the things that I'm conscious of. I don't want to enable leaders. I want to empower them. And I think that that's where you're trying to find the balance between research and practical solutions too.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And one of the things you said there that is an interesting thing, and I think you're right on, is that so much of teacher professional development is focused on the teachers, and we offer leadership work and learning and really try to engage them. I think there's 2 pieces. I don't know how what you feel about sort of hierarchies. My guess is that hierarchies and flattening those would suit your taste more. But as we think about leadership, I think we want to see some of the same elements, leaders with their staff and their teachers as learners, and that relationship as we do with teachers and students as learners. And so engaging them in some of the similar processes, so you see some of those through lines, and engaging in those conversations. And as you mentioned, walkthroughs, and as a former teacher, I always sort of found it maddening that somebody would walk through and look for things, and that we're supposed to have binders and there's non-negotiables and all those things, as opposed to overarching sort of purpose why statements, and I'm a big believer in mission statements and vision, and really using those as anchors and lenses for the work that we're doing. And I'm wondering, as we talk about rubrics and think about rubrics for teachers and students, essentially a walkthrough is kind of that. I'm a big fan of single point rubrics, where you can add narrative, right? And as you talk about your new book coming out, that narrative, that idea that when you're evaluating something, when you're analyzing something, that you're looking at it and saying, this is the evidence I see of it, of great example of that going well, or you're doing this well, it's meeting this ideal, this standard. This is maybe, I wonder if you're doing this and it's not helping, if it's not supporting that. And so single point rubrics for teachers and students allow that narrative to happen. And could we use, or should we use, and maybe it's a similar version that you when you work with leadership, is that narrative, right? Sitting down and examples, evidence of, here's what I saw that really supported great school culture. Here's what I saw that was evidence that made me wonder about your school culture. And let's kind of discuss that, as opposed to regular rubrics, which is box 1, box 2, box 3, box 4, maybe box 5, and this is the indicator next to the bullet point, and I'm trying to find evidence that matches exactly that, or something like that, and now I'm sort of trapped as an evaluator.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I was making my 3rd attempt at a community college when I was younger, I heard 2 words that kind of ruined me forever, and those 2 words were, it depends. I think that... I mean, seriously, I think that there are times that you could use a rubric, and if you're using it in the right way, where there's going to be a narrative and a conversation, then it's probably going to work out really well. But if you're leaving the rubric behind and there's no conversation, then why are you doing it in the first place? If you're, even with feedback is an awesome thing. But if you don't have a conversation with a teacher at the beginning to say, so tell me, if I sit down next to the kids and ask them what they're learning, what's the common language that I should be looking for? Because I don't totally understand your content, but I'm coming in, that kind of stuff. If you're not having that vulnerable, open conversation, then any feedback you leave is not going to stick. If it's not wrapped around a learning intention and a success criteria, if it's not wrapped around that learning goal, then it's just going to be this one-sided thing. On the flip side of this is when people will look at me and say, but we don't have the time. And my feeling, and I might come off very brutal when I say this, and believe me, I got caught in the time trap as well. And I got caught in the let's tick it off the box and all that kind of stuff. I do not want anyone to think that I was by any means a perfect principal, because I was not. But I had to learn and say, this is not a valuable piece of my time, or a valuable use of my time. And that's when I started slowing down the process. And when people say, time is a factor, I get that. But the reality is you're spending all this time doing this stuff that becomes reactive, when if you took some of that off your plate and said, you know what, instead of going into 10 classrooms today to do a walkthrough, I'm going to actually have 3 conversations with teachers before I go into their classroom. And you're still going to work out and get through, for lack of a better way of saying it, get through all of the staff. I think sometimes we put it on our plate that when we start a walkthrough, we're supposed to go through all of these classrooms, and get them all done. That's such flawed thinking. We need to be able to say, you know what, maybe it's better use of my time if I only go through 3 or 4 or 5 classrooms, but I've had the pre-conversation with the teacher to begin with. I'm always looking for, and sometimes it happens after I find myself reactive and exhausted, I'm always looking for ways to be proactive so I don't go down that road again. And so whether it's a rubric, whatever, to me, it kind of depends on what kind of conversations are you having around it. And all of that stuff matters, because people, I've got leaders that say, well, I've got to go in and do observations, but they hadn't been walking into classrooms. They go into classrooms twice a year to do the observations. And I've honestly looked at leaders and said, you have 0 credibility when you're giving feedback to the teachers. And they're kind of like, what do you mean? And I said, if you're in the classroom twice a year, and then you're going to go in and you're going to try to give feedback on what you see in the classroom, you have 0 credibility, because teachers are going to look at that and say, you have no credibility to tell me what to do in the classroom. You're never here.
Right.
So, I think we need to look at, it's not one thing that matters, it's everything we do that matters. I walked into classrooms to say good morning every single morning. They called it my morning rounds. And there were days that it was crisis mode, and that was the only thing I could do to get into classrooms. But then there were other days that I could go into certain classrooms throughout the day, or even all of the classrooms throughout the day, or I was out at recess, or I was in the lunchroom or something like that, or in the hallway at least. I think all of that kind of visibility and engagement piece, where you're getting to know kids' names and you're talking to teachers. I flipped faculty meetings, which meant that we were focusing on learning together. And when they had a problem, I cared about the problem they were having in the classroom. I think all of that stuff matters when we go in to do our walkthroughs. Because if we haven't done the other stuff and we're just coming in with a clipboard, that sends a really horrific message.
Yeah, I had. It reminds me of a couple things when I was teaching, and by no means was I perfect as a teacher either. But I did some good things, and increasingly as my career when I was in the classroom for 15 years, and I'd like to think that I got better over those 15 years. I had one administrator at one point give me the evaluation form and ask me to fill it out, which I just patently refused. It's like, you got to be kidding me. I'm not doing your job. I'm busy enough doing mine, right? And I didn't do that. But I also had another administrator that somebody had come in and they had seen some peer critique protocol, some work that my students were doing, and told a different administrator and said, man, he's doing some really good things in the classroom. And my principal, who she had told, said, oh man, I'd heard you're doing some really great things in your classroom. I'm thinking, like you said, you should know that, right?
Yeah, I know. That should not be new information for you.
Right. And even, whether it's a rubric or whatever, but those conversations and the dialogue, the professional dialogue, and we find that in our workshops and our work with teachers and leaders, that when the teachers are dying for that. Educators are dying for that professional dialogue that they so rarely get a chance to have. They want to share, they want to get feedback, they want to improve their craft, they want to get better, but they don't have time to do it, and they don't have structures to do it, and they don't have a culture of doing it. And that is the important piece, right? It's not, sort of, so you hear, I hear stories of, we're going to get some subs for our teachers, or on our planning periods are going to go visit other teachers. I think that's a great idea, but that's a first step, right? It's going in, but also having some conversation and saying, here's what I saw that I really liked, and here's some things that I have some questions about, and how might I use this in my classroom? And again, getting at that professional dialogue that educators and I think principal, I don't know what you think, but I think being a principal is one of the hardest jobs in the education system. My mother was a principal, and she tried to get me to do that, and I said, you got to be crazy. You're under fire from every single stakeholder in the education ecosystem, and everybody thinks that you have all this autonomy to do all these things, and when in fact you have almost, it's just not even remotely close, right?
No, you're totally stuck in the middle. And it's funny, I had a principal when I was going back to do my master's. I was doing it in educational psychology, and I had a principal who had been in the district for 50 years. So crazy, right? 50 years. And he said, I think you should go and get your degree in administration, because that's what it was called back in the late 90s. And I looked at him and I seriously said, I'm never going to be a principal. And I remember saying that. And there were these two retired teachers that I used to see at the gym where I worked out in Poughkeepsie, New York. And I was talking to them about that. And one of them said, well, what if you could be the principal you want to be and not the principal you think you have to be? And I honestly, I wrote about it in Collaborative Leadership, because that statement, although I still kind of sat there and said, yeah, it's not in my cards. And you have to keep in mind, I was a struggling learner who barely graduated from high school. So my idea of being a principal was just so what I thought was out of my reach. But a couple of years later, I was in a new school up here in Albany, New York, and I just remember just kind of looking and saying, you know what, I could honestly be a principal. I think I can do it. But it was hard work. And I was incredibly fortunate, because for many years we had a very supportive sort of team across the district of administrators. But I also had, and it's not that we got along all the time and saw eye to eye, but I had an incredible staff to be able to work with, and families and the kids. And honestly, I loved being a principal. I was there for 7.5, 8 years, and I left only because I was going to be working with John. And the reason why I say 7.5 or 8 years is because I actually took a leave of absence for the last 6 months of my principalship, because I wasn't sure if working with John and being a trainer and being a consultant was really going to work for me. And it was, when I started to have all these experiences with John, that I said, you know what, I'm going to leave. But that was a very difficult decision for me. But I would not trade in any of the things that happened to me when I was a principal, because I learned from the staff that I worked with, and it was always kind of interesting, because when I first started, I had no experience. And I remember I was interviewing in front of a panel of 17 people. And back in those olden days, you had portfolios, but they were in binders. They, weren't online and all that stuff. And I did not have a leadership portfolio because I had no experience. But they asked me what kind of leader I would be. And I said, and I distinctly remember looking at the panel, and it was parents, teachers, and administrators. And I said, I can't tell you what kind of administrator I will be. I can only show you the kind of teacher I was, and hope that I would have the same sort of impact as a school leader and focusing on that learning. And I handed out my portfolio as a teacher, which I still have to this day. And that really kind of won them over. And I wanted to make sure that I stuck to that word. And was every day perfect? Not at all. But I was in classrooms every day. And when I first started, I told them, I said, I miss being in the classroom. Like, I really want to get to know the kids. I want to get to know your the way you teach and be able to figure out like my entry point to help you. And I want you to be able to help me. And for I would say a good year and a half, it was like they would call each other when I walked out of the room going, did Peter go into your room? Did Peter go into your room? And, finally I knew in my head that I wanted one thing to happen. When I used to walk into classrooms early on, the teachers would look at me and say, hi, do you need something?
Right.
And I remember thinking to myself, I will know that I've been successful when I walk into the classroom and they no longer ask me if I need something, that they just kind of let me be by going into the classroom and sitting down with kids. And I swear to you, I got to that point where when I walked in, I wasn't asked why I was there. Nobody said, hey, Dr. DeWitt, do you need something from me? And that's when I knew I got to a pretty cool point in my principalship.
That's a good sort of canary in the coal mine, if you will. And I remember, I've told the story, I think, a couple times where I remember a specific moment as a teacher, not that I was ever particularly interested in the dog and pony show or putting on airs for, the evaluation or anything like that. But I remember as a teacher, the moment when I really explicitly realized that I didn't have to be sort of afraid of my principal. And I won't go into the details of the story, but I think that is that is something that, as you sort of point out there, that teachers are intimidated, afraid, if at best nervous when a quote-unquote administrator walks in. And what we want to get to is that point where they almost don't notice you. I mean, certainly we don't want people coming in rooms that we don't notice, but
right.
that just is just a norm that we're used to. And I wonder, like, what do you see the balance, or how you might characterize this differently? Are because I like to think of it as sort of principals or assistant principal or admin, or maybe you probably have a better word for that, but I see them as largely support staff for teachers.
That's, and that's the way I want it to be, but that's just not the way that it is. Working with Jim Knight was always really awesome. And the only reason why I don't work with Jim anymore is because the collaborative leadership work started taking off. But working with Jim, one of the things he always talks about is status. And that as soon as you're not a teacher, you're seen as having this status. So it was always in the instructional coaching lens. Instructional coaches are seen as having the status, and that's not always a good thing, because people will look and say, well, you're no longer in the classroom, which is crazy because they're still in the school, but you're no longer in the classroom. And so it took a while for instructional coaches to realize, listen, you have this status that people are looking at you as if, oh, it's the stepping stone to administration, or they're the administrator's confidant, and all of these sort of nuances that happen. And I realized, as a school principal, I had that status because kids would come in because they were coming to the school for the first time, and I would walk them around, give them a tour with their parents when I could, and then we would end in my office. And I remember so many parents would look and say, I never want you to have to come in here. And I was like, please don't say that. I see kids for good reasons more than I see them for bad reasons.
Right.
And that status piece, that it creates this divide between us and them. And yes, there are times when difficult decisions are being made and it becomes the administrators want us to do that. I get that. But how can we spend our time kind of getting over that status piece? And I was always profoundly impacted by Robert Greenleaf's work on servant leadership back in the 70s. And I think that I always looked at leadership as in, how do I serve you? How can I help you? And how can I empower you and not enable you? And that's probably what makes the building leadership much more difficult, because sometimes you're enabling when you mean to be empowering. And I think that all of that kind of works toward like trying to make sure that you're empowering teachers. But the problem is, you were mentioning earlier, you said I'm somewhat myopic, maybe because you didn't necessarily see my work a few years ago. I was myopic in a way that I would look at building principles and think, okay, this is the way it is because that's how I am as a building principal. And that's what I would write about when I was, writing the blog back then. I was writing it from my perspective as a building principal because I didn't know anything else. in this job over the past 4.5 years, I have learned an incredible amount, from superintendents to principals to even how we run workshops, where I will have school districts say, will you come and train our instructional coaches? And I'll say, hey, are the principals going to be there? And they're like, no, the principals are busy. And I'm like, we should really be training together, because they need to know what instructional coaches do. And then boom, after the instructional coaches come in, they're like, hey, are our principals going to get trained, because they need to know how to support us? And then I get a call back from the district saying, can you come back and train principals? And I'm like, if you just listened to me at the beginning,
Right.
you would have saved me. And we would have, I would have worked this all out. But I've seen too many principals in workshops that they really don't want to work in partnership with teachers. And that might sound crazy to people who listen to your podcasts, and they might be sitting there saying, as a principal, no way, I'm in the building, or I'm in the classrooms. But the reality is, I've seen a lot of principals that don't want to work in partnership. They want that status of being the administrator, because they're like, hey, we worked hard for this status. And what they don't understand is that true leadership is when you share that power with the people you work with. And sometimes it's a self-efficacy piece where they don't feel, they don't have that belief in themselves that they can give up some of the control. But other time, it's an insecurity where they're like, if I give up some of the control, it's going to look like I'm a bad leader. And in my reality, I had a couple of teachers that once, they would have just been vocal if I tried to do that in the first place. But I think we cared about each other so much that I trusted the fact that I could give up some of my power or perceived power, and that we could share this together. And I think it would work really well.
Well, it's really, you're hitting what I would, one of my sweet spots. And as we do workshops, it's that same thing. And we see it so often as well. And we try to have those conversations, as I'm sure you do, ahead of time, saying, so where will the leadership be, or the admin, or the coaches? And I don't know which one of us could, if I had a dime for every time I heard this, I'd be a rich man. Neither of us would have to worry about retirement, because they almost always say, oh yes, principals will be there, they'll be involved. And I say, principals are busy people, and I know it's summer and they got to be hiring and all those things. And my experience is that they are there, but they're not really there. And for the focus of our work, we do lots of different types of work, but project-based learning is our most popular, and I think our most powerful, and in sort of overall shift. And we try to really drive home the point, and we say it, is how do can we get principals and leadership and instructional coaches all engaging in the work? And if teachers are creating a project, principals should be creating a project. And I've written some blogs about that PBL mindset for leadership, and it is about, and I've seen some great examples, and I think our listeners probably have that same reflection that you mentioned of like, well, that sounds weird. But at the same time, I think many of them would say they're going to get involved, but they really don't the way that we want them to, and we see the value in, right? So they're creating a project that's working on an authentic problem in their school, and they're engaging with their staff as learners and getting questions from those learners and those staff, and the best leaders, I think one of those qualities is have that PBL mindset where it's saying, here's our problem as a school, how can we, it's an open-ended challenge, and as a leader, I'm responsible for asking the right question, and you and me and us, we're collaboratively solving that problem, and that democratizes, that engages those stakeholders in a way that is empowering. And as you said, so it feels like they're giving up some power, but it's really not. It's actually empowering them and engaging in that self-efficacy piece. I do think is a piece, an insecurity, right? That, and I know I think your latest blog hits on that. The idea of principals having a coach, like that's almost, it's like, why would I need a coach? I'm a principal, I'm an expert, right? Well, that's just patently absurd, but that's kind of a mindset.
And it's there are a couple of things there. Number one, when it comes to running workshops, and I know you agree with this, like I get it. The onus is on me to make sure that I'm giving them something that they can use, because too often workshops have been a complete waste of time. They've been compliance based, or they've been, because of mandates or whatever. So, I do a pre-engagement survey, and I've learned a lot from doing those pre-engagement surveys, because there are people that have literally written like, I've never heard your name. I don't know what you do. I just hope it's not going to be boring. And people were like, seriously, and people were like, oh my God, somebody wrote that. And I'm going, yeah, but you know what? That doesn't bother me.
That's
you
great.
know why? Because it speaks to the frustration they have. And I know when I would need to walk in, I need to make sure that I'm knocking it out of the park and I'm giving them something that they need. But the other thing about what you were saying too is that there are lots of leaders that will walk into a meeting with one idea and they want to walk out with the same one. And I get where that comes from, because it's kind of like, I'm the leader, I should have the best idea, right? But the reality is, I want to be the leader that walks into a meeting with an idea and walks out with a better one. And like, I learned that as going into the faculty and kind of looking at them and sensing their frustration with feeling like they had no voice and all of those kind of pieces. And I just feel like, maybe it's the older I get or the more impatient that I am, there is just no reason for a leader to want to walk in and think that their idea always has to be the best one, because it's just simply not true. And if you work with an awesome staff, there's a reason why you've got that staff around you. I remember I was working somewhere and I was talking about collective efficacy, this collective belief we have, that we can go up against any obstacle and come out better on the other side. And it's much more complicated than that, obviously. But I remember working with this one group, and it was in the South, and the male principals were not really loving having me there. And I was talking about collective efficacy, and it was clear that they didn't know really what I was talking about. And I finally realized that they were football coaches. So I said, raise your hand if you're a football coach. And all of these guys, middle school principals, high school principals, raised their hand. And they were like, they're football coaches. So for their school, which was just so odd to me that you could be a principal and a football coach, and I'm sure there are good and bad parts of that. But I said, so when you're going up against a stronger opponent in a football game, do you tell them your team they're going to lose? And, that was just, they were like, no, we would never do that. And I said, that's collective efficacy. It doesn't mean you're always going to win, but it means you have your belief in your team that you can go up against a stronger opponent, and you will probably win, and you'll come out the other side much better as a team. And I said, the unfortunate thing is, you have that as football coaches, you don't have that as school principals, because you don't believe in your teachers as much as you believe in your football team. And that's, to me, that's where it comes down to, because when I was a principal, and I swear to you, I am on Facebook with a bunch of my teachers, and I had a former parent the other day post a comment on my Facebook page with my picture, and it said, it warms my heart that every time I look up Post and Kill Elementary School, Peter DeWitt's face comes up, and I haven't been a principal there in 4.5 years. But I will tell you that one of the reasons why things went so well is because I believed in the teachers and the parents and the kids that much.
Yeah. Well, and you've got to believe in yourself, and it's that those insecurities that we all have about our work, our thinking, and personal things. It's so important to recognize those and realize that they're there, and think, okay, so how do we grow and how do we use our strengths? And it's okay that I have weaknesses. And if I'm a principal or a teacher, it's kind of a very similar dynamic of a teacher feeling like they have to have all the answers, and a kid says, what's the answer? And I don't know. Well, why aren't you? Right. You're the teacher. You're supposed to know. Well, no, that's not really. That's what you might have been conditioned to believe, but that's certainly not the reality of where we should be going. We've been talking about ideals, and I want to get to some practical stuff here. As you think about and work with schools, like what is your sort of practical, pragmatic advice for principals or leaders in sort of how we innovate a school? Like if you come to a school that is really struggling in lots of ways, and you say, this is my vision for where I want it to go. There's lots of moving parts. There's a big ecosystem and stakeholders. Like, what are there I don't know if there's 7 steps or things like that.
I'm a big fan of school climate, and I think that there are a couple of things. I think that answer is going to depend, or may look different depending on the principal that's listening, meaning that you really have to understand your current reality. I was very fortunate as a principal because I took over for somebody my predecessor, who was becoming the assistant superintendent, and she was an outstanding principal, and sometimes that's hard because you're taking over for a good act. It's easier to take over for a bad act. But the reality was I had the luxury to kind of go in and spend months sort of getting the lay of the land and understanding where my entry point was going to be. And I even had a former music teacher. She said to me, she goes, "You were very smart your first year." She said, "You never made big changes." She said, "You came in and you wanted to see where you fit in." And I was like, like too many leaders go in and they think their job is to make changes right away. And all that does is make teachers say, "Oh God, here's another principal that's going to make changes and they're not going to stay." I think our job is to actually get an understanding of our current reality and where we are, and then try to figure out how we can help grow in that certain situation. Stop chasing after the shiny new toy because there isn't one. We do that too often too. That happens with John's research. Oh, I read John Hattie's book, so I'm going to go and do this. Mm-hmm. That is not what John wants you to do, because there's a lot of research and a lot of depth to that research. I think for me, it's develop a common language. And I know that sounds somewhat simple, but it's so much more difficult, because at the heart of our issues is that if I'm talking to you, Drew, and you're my principal or even my instructional coach and I'm the teacher, and you say, "Okay, so we're going to work on student engagement." Well, I might think student engagement is compliant engagement, where the kids are sitting down in their seats, raising their hand, doing what I said. And your idea is authentic engagement, where the kids are leaning in and doing cooperative grouping and that kind of stuff. If we don't develop a common language and a common understanding, every time we talk, we're going to be off the mark. Even with feedback, people will look and say, "Well, I give feedback all the time." Well, if it's not wrapped around that learning goal and what that might look like successfully, there's going to be a problem. If we don't understand Stone and Heen's work, they're out of Harvard, and they wrote a great book called Thanks for the Feedback. If we don't understand that there are feedback triggers that we have that go off when we get feedback, no matter if we're looking for it or not, those feedback triggers can prevent us from moving forward. So for me, it's, what is your current reality? Where are you going to start? And do you have a common understanding of what that will look like? Because if you don't have that common understanding, if you were talking about PBL, you know this. If you don't walk in and develop a common language and a common understanding about what PBL looks like, then people are just going to keep operating in different ways. And that's where self-efficacy comes into play too, because there are going to be people in that room that have no idea what you're talking about, but they don't feel like they can tell you. So every time you go into their room, you're going to be like, "Oh my God, I've been talking about PBL at every faculty meeting. They're still not doing it." It's because they don't feel like they can ask you what PBL actually looks like. So that common understanding, that common language, is probably the best place to start.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me, or makes me think about kind of going back to some of the things that we hit on and really think about with assessment and the language with students, is that qualitative language and that deeper critical thinking in those conversations, because you have to sort of operationalize, unpack those words. Otherwise, you don't really know what those words are. And the same thing is true in so many ways with leadership. So one of the things that you hit on there, and I know I put it out on Twitter, and you communicated with actually one of my former podcast guests and a friend of mine, Jennifer Cox, and she had asked, and I don't know if, I think you had gone back and forth, and maybe she's got this answer, but I think our listeners might benefit from this, is that idea of moving those things along, those innovations that are aligned with the district and school vision without creating that initiative fatigue. And how do we do that as leaders to create, to not get that initiative fatigue that you and I know, as soon as you walk into a workshop, they're going, "Oh, this is the latest thing, and this is only going to last 6 months."
Yep. I think it always goes back to what's the common theme. I was in Toronto for the past couple of days working with a French school board. up there, and we were trying. What I had to do is bring together a disconnect because up especially in the Ontario area, they call it school board when we might in the U.S. call it school districts. But so their school board, each school building within the school board had an initiative that they had to come after because it was based on their improvement plan. But they also had, and I had them do this activity that would draw out the greatest challenges. I had to help throughout that day to make sure they understood how the challenges and that improvement plan were actually much. They had much more in common than they thought. They thought the improvement plan, not all of them, but many of the people thought the improvement plan was one place over here, and they thought that the challenges they faced were on the other side of the spectrum. And it took a lot of dialogue throughout that day to get them to understand that those are very interconnected. So for me, what has always worked for me, whether it was a school teacher, a school principal, or running workshops and stuff, is I always look for common themes. I always look for how are these things interrelated? And that's where the 6 influences came from in collaborative leadership. They're not distinctly 6 different things. They actually have a common thread throughout all 6, and they came from a place where school leaders or teachers would ask, where do we start, where John Hattie's research was concerned. I think that's what leaders need to do. They need to kind of step back and say, how is this initiative going to help us? And how well have we articulated why we need this initiative? And do people really have a common understanding around what this initiative means? Because too often teachers have been on the receiving end of that shiny new toy that just doesn't work.
Yeah, and it can be absolutely frustrating and counterproductive and defeating for moving the work forward in a better direction or in an innovative and positive direction. So I'm mindful of your time. His name is Peter DeWitt. He's an author and consultant. You can find him on Twitter at Peter M. DeWitt, DeWitt. And Peter, where else should folks find you and click and all that good stuff?
They can do a Google search and just put in my name and my website will come up. That's probably another good place to start. But if they have any comments, please know that they can tweet to me and we can connect that way too.
Great. Well, again, I'm mindful of your time, but I really do feel like I could have this conversation for hours and hours. And there's in my notes, there's lots of things that we didn't hit, so maybe we'll return to this at some point. But thank you again.
Thanks, Drew. That would be awesome. I'd love to connect again.
That'll do it for today's podcast. Thanks so much for listening, and if you didn't hate it, please leave us a review on iTunes or wherever you're listening, and share it on social media wherever you feel comfortable. Speaking of social media, you can find us in all the normal places like Facebook, Twitter, Google+, LinkedIn, Pinterest, and please share us on those places as well. And don't forget about TeachThought Professional Development. You can find us there at teachthought.com/PD.